So when we're going through this whole malt series, there are a handful of malts that are actually really difficult to categorize. So we're going to be doing those as videos on themselves. One of those is acidulated malt, also known as acid malt, and that's what we're going to talk about today.
Boom, awesome graphic. So to start in, let's talk about how acid malt is made. Acid malts are base malts by nature that then go through a lacto fermentation, which is where you're gonna get that acid on the malt before they re-dry it out and ship it out to us.
So what this means is, first of all, it's not sprayed with lactic acid like some people think. It goes through a natural fermentation of lactic acid, which gives you some nuanced flavors and some other qualities that we're gonna go over in the near future. One of those is the fact that there's gonna be more lactic acid producing bacteria left on the grains. So when it comes to using acid malt, there's basically three different ways that we see it used. And the first is going to be just to balance your mash pH. Now this depends a lot on things like your source water, what water you're using to begin with, the size of your grist, the colors of the grains that you're already using, and the level of minerals in there that can buffer against pH change in your water.
The second way we're going to actually use this is going to be to pre-acidulate some wort. This is something that you're probably going to be using if you actually want to cross that flavor threshold, which I think we found for a 5-gallon batch here tends to be right around maybe 8 to 12 ounces.
And again, that depends on your beer style, but basically this can do a couple things. One of them just being brightening up your hop flavor. If you want to cross that flavor threshold, just add a touch more acidity. It can really pronounce some hops.
Yeah, especially some of these New World hops. It really, for me, it kind of makes like almost pineapple notes pop out at you.
Yeah.
And then also what that's gonna do for pre-acidulation is if you wanna do a kettle sour, using high amounts of it, somewhere in that 2-pound range for a 5-gallon batch, is actually going to acidify your wort enough that it's going to be selective towards those lactic acid bacteria that you really want in there.
And this is pretty important for doing things like kettles and mash sours, because you want to make sure that you're not letting anything that can contaminate your wort getting in there. So this will make sure that lactobacillus or any acid producing bacteria that you're looking for are the only ones that can be fermenting your wort past a certain point. And this is actually 4.2 pH is that food safe range that you're going for. So 4.2 pH or under is a perfect starting point if you wanted to do a kettle or mash sour. Now that leads us to the third thing that we can do with acid malt, which is actually use it as an inoculant.
So these acid malts have lactic producing bacteria on them already. So if we add those right at that, I usually prefer to go about 120 to 125 degree range and steep them like you would any kind of other grains. You're actually going to inoculate that wort with that bacteria. It's going to do its thing and continue to sour it even more.
Now, let's talk about things that you get off of that grain when off the acid malt. Because the one thing that I want to talk about flavor-wise is that acid malt has a more complex flavor than just using straight lactic acid.
Yeah, so a lot to do with that complex flavor. It's not necessarily from the lactic acid that's already on the malt itself, but it more so has to do with the fermentation that goes on after the inoculation.
So once you pass that flavor threshold, we prefer using acid malt versus just using straight lactic acid for that extra maturity. But let's now go into where that flavor threshold is, and then what all you can be using that lactic acid, or how to use the acidulated malt.
So speaking of that flavor threshold, we find that in a 5-gallon batch, somewhere in that range of about 11 to 12 ounces, crosses that threshold of just using it as a pH adjustment to actually tasting some degree of acidity. In these low quantities, what that can actually do is cause hops to change in their profile. A lot of times you might be able to get a hop that goes from like a piney flavor and turn that into more of a pineapple flavor.
Just a touch of acidity, and you can see this in cooking too, just a touch of acidity is a really important thing for balancing out a lot of stuff and really brightening up flavors. And it works the same in beer as it does as adding a hint of lime to your tacos or whatever.
Yep.
So let's talk about pH adjustment for a little bit. On a very neutral water profile, let's say you use distilled water and you're using 10 pounds of light grain, for example. You can use about 6 ounces of acid malt to get your mash pH down to around 5.2, which is kind of what you're aiming for. Now, it's really important to note that this changes a lot depending on your source water and the grist that you're using. There's a popular article going around that says that 1% of your grist, if you use that for acid malt, equals a 0.1% pH change, which is kind of it's a weird thing that someone would make that a popular thing to think about because first of all, pH is logarithmic, as we all know, right, Ryan?
Right.
Which means it's basically exponentially changing. Every 1 pH is 10 times. Every 1 pH decrease is 10 times more acid than the pH above it. And so using a direct scale, a linear scale like that is kind of silly in the first place. But this also changes with things like the minerals in your water buffering against pH change. It changes with the darkness of your grain, adding certain acidity regardless. The size of your grist, the amount of water that you're using. So giving a flat statement like that is kind of silly.
Yeah, I think what really Peter's trying to say is that this is a very complex thing, and reading a lot of these things online will make it seem approachable, but really they're an oversimplification. And really when you go to play with acidity in your beer, you want to kind of know your water chemistry. You want to know all of the factors that are leading into that so you get the desired effect.
So really what it comes down to is find out what works for you, depending on your situation. In our area, we kind of know our water pretty well, and so when people come in to us asking how much acid malt should they use in a certain style, we have a pretty good estimate just based off of our own experience. If you're not sure and you haven't gotten down your water calculations, which by the way, we'll post some links to calculators below that are very, very helpful, at least try a couple things and find out what makes your beer taste the best. That's kind of that's the easiest way to go without trying to get too technical or without trying to use some over generic methodology that you found online. So for the record, if you want to learn more about making a sour beer, we did an awesome video about brewing a sour beer with the Brewer's Edge mash and boil. We'll put an iCard up somewhere there. Other than that, that's pretty much it about acid malt. Like we said before, we use Best Malt's acidulated malt, and so that's the one that we're most comfortable working with. If you have any questions on that, any other acid malts, or anything in the acidity world or water pH world, let us know in the comments below.
Yep, shoot them down there. Otherwise, that's it for our acid malt video. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time on Genus Brewing.
Cheers, guys.
The beer. Oh, I'm out. I'm out.